I sense a lot of intellectual energy around. It's quite amazing, actually. So I'm so grateful to the panelists from the two panels for creating that sort of, outburst of energy and thinking and coming up with ideas and so on. So that's great. And now I think it's my, great pleasure and distinct honor to introduce to you Radosław Sikorski. For anyone who studies European politics, Radosław Sikorski does not need any introduction. But nevertheless, for some of you who are not trained Europeanists or not watch the European politics, let me mention a couple of things. So Radek Sikorski graduated from Oxford University with degree in politics, philosophy and economy, the famous PPE. He was living in England as a political refugee for a number of years, and at that time did a lot of unusual things, being the war correspondent in Afghanistan and in Angola. And then, when 1989 happened, Radek came back to Poland, had a very distinguished political career. He was the Minister of Defense of Poland, then for a long time the Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2007 to 2014, then the Marshal of Polish Parliament, the Marshal of Sejm. He published several books, during that time, and in 2012 was named as one of the 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. Now, Radek Sikorski is the member of European Parliament, where he serves in the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence, and the Subcommittee on Security and Defense. He also chairs the Delegation for Relations with the United States. Radek has been the Senior Fellow of the Center for European Studies for many years, and we are very proud of that. Please.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for saying I need no introduction when something similar was said of Henry Kissinger. He said, well, it's true, I don't need any introduction, but they give me so much pleasure. Trouble with coming late in the day is that all the clever things have already been said. The topic is Poland at a crossroads. But I'm happy to report to you that Poland has crossed the crossroads and chose the right turn. And so disaster has been averted because I think Polish democracy would not have survived the third term of a populist authoritarian government. And in fact, if PiS had won, I had an idea for another book, The Guilty Men, the 50 people who took us back to autocracy. Because institutions are important, procedures are important, electoral laws are important, but you still need people who will obey the spirit of the Constitution, of the laws. And you don't need very many opportunists or cowards or idiots to subvert the And that's not just in Poland, as you know. You were, what, 60 seconds away and Mike Pence away? And the other thing is, of course, the role of personalities. If Donald Tusk had not come back, I'm not sure we would have won this. It works both ways, of course. Luck also matters. In 2015, we were unlucky. The left party went into the election as a coalition, which required an 8% threshold, and its leader, a very able debater, Mr. Zandberg, did well in a debate, and that took votes away from the other faction, and it meant that the left didn't make it into parliament by 30,000 votes. Whereas this time we got lucky. The leader of the Third Way, Szymon Hołownia, did well in the debate, and everybody made it into parliament, and we have the majority, even though PiS is the largest party. Luck matters. Of course, electoral systems also matter, and I'll come back to that. Secularization has already been mentioned. My impression is that in this election, the people of Poland outflanked the political elites from the left. That the Polish people have modernized, that the process of secularization has proceeded, the magical thinking has less of a role in politics, and the pandemic helped because I think in hindsight we will be looking at the time of the pandemic as the moment when churches emptied in Poland, for better and for worse, because what will fill the role of the Catholic religion may or may not be better. Then there is a very simple factor that is usually cited in U.S. elections. For the previous 2 quarters, the Polish economy went through a stagflation, and I'm told that it's a rule of thumb in this country that if the economy is not growing for 2 quarters before a presidential election, the incumbent loses. Well. The abortion issue was important. I live in the countryside. My local town is called Szubin, and it has a population of 14,000. And when the abortion judgment was passed, there were over 1,000 people demonstrating in Szubin. It was the largest demonstration in the history of the town since the 14th century. Almost exclusively young people, young women. Young men were protecting the churches, which were not being attacked. Young women were in the march. And American participants should know that this change of the law, and it wasn't done democratically through Parliament, was really, really drastic. It made the Polish regulation tougher than the regulation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. In Iran, when the fetus is damaged, you can terminate. In Poland, technically still, you can't. You can only intervene when the life of the woman is in danger. So what the doctors, somewhat cowardly, were doing were they were waiting for a damaged fetus to die inside the woman. And then sepsa comes in, I mean, I'm not a doctor, but pretty quickly. And you can miss the moment. And they were missing the moment and women were dying. And as Carolina was saying, this created an outrage, and not just among women, because it's just nuts. PiS ran a bad campaign. They spent more money than us on internet, but it was badly targeted. We hit them with the visa scandal, which technically wasn't that big. The assistant of a deputy minister took bribes for speeding up something like 250 or 300 visas. But it was the sign of a much larger problem. Namely, PiS gained power by exploiting the 2015 migration problem. The leader of PiS, Kaczynski, was saying these people bring not bacteria, but parasites and something else. And then they proceeded to issue 250,000 of work visas for people from outside Europe, the largest number in Poland's 1,000-year history, ever. I mean, probably larger than all of the migration into Poland from outside Europe for the previous 1,000 years. And you could see it in the streets of Polish cities. You know, if you ordered an Uber or you ordered Uber Eats, you got a Bangladeshi actually a lot of former Soviet, nominally Muslim Central Asia. The point is that the PiS electorate noticed, and the contrast was huge, and it got glued together into one big scandal with the visa issue, because they opened up the Polish border without a migration strategy, without a debate in parliament, without really announcing anything. They just opened the border under the pressure from Polish industry, obviously, who needed the workers. And for the first time, the center gained the votes of Polish uniformed services. And when you add them up, the police, the army, the prison service, the customs service, plus their families, you're talking a couple of million people. Partly because they all got tired of being used for party political purposes. You know, policemen having to essentially attack these young women demonstrating, and soldiers being notoriously used as backdrop to politicians making propaganda statements. And what the Minister of Defense did at the height of the election campaign, the army found unacceptable. As a former defense minister, I can tell you that in the Polish General Staff, there is one building deep underground where most of the personnel of the General Staff don't even have access. And as Minister of Defense, you can't even take a pencil in, because that's where we draw up our operational plans for the defense of the country. And the United States has probably a contingency plan for occupying Mexico and Canada. You are allowed to have contingency plans for any eventuality. And so Poland had a plan A, which was collective defense under NATO, Article 5, and a plan B in case, as has happened in our history, the Allies are late. And the fifth stage of this plan B was that we make a last stance on the river Vistula, which of course is operationally correct. And the government made it up into betrayal of Eastern Poland. We were going to give up Eastern Poland to the fate of Bucha, which was of course total demagoguery. But what the army really objected to was that the publication of the most holy of holies of the most secret things inside the Polish army. I think we won in the end because the election was, in fact, in the end, on whether we stay in the West or are taken into some kind of experiment. You know, elections are usually won on whether you can shape the issue, or you're lucky that it becomes about an issue in which you're strong. You know, in Britain, if the labor market is the issue, then usually labor wins. If something, in Poland, if the election had been about cultural issues, we probably would have lost. but it was sufficient doubts were made in the minds of electors that PiS might actually take us out of the European Union. And people went out and said, we don't want that. And they would have done, because, you know, on their definition of sovereignty, which is a purely Farage type definition of sovereignty, namely as legal self-sufficiency. I sign treaties, but if I find them inconvenient, I don't have to live by them, sovereignty. Well, on that basis, the European Union could never have been created. Poland could never have joined it. And sooner or later would have been pushed out, because the club cannot tolerate a member, and a large member, that just doesn't abide by the rules. And one of those right-wing magazines that got lavish support from state-controlled companies actually put it on its front page. Let us get out of the European Union. And, you know, I was able to show that headline with the list of sponsors, which was Central Bank of Poland, various ministries, state TV, and the key state companies. So it wasn't just a joke, you know. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is that the 8 years of PiS was, to my mind, a revolt against meritocracy. One of the first things that they decided when they took power was to abolish competitive examinations to the civil service. The lowering of standards in the diplomatic service came a little later. So, for example, they abolished the requirement of having to have 2 languages, because, you know, their children and their friends also want to see the world, and they don't speak the languages. One of the first enterprise that they took over is a Polish horse stud farm called Janów Podlaski, which dates back to the 18th century. It survived the partitions of Poland, it survived Nazi occupation, it survived communism, and they managed to destroy it by having 7 different chairmen in as many years. Let me give you an example from my constituency, my hometown of Bydgoszcz, which happens to house the largest factory producing nitrogen and explosives in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's huge. Okay? They purged the people who had run it successfully and put in a party loyalist whose previous job was to run and own a shop selling aquaria. Literally. I mean, a complete nobody. And it was like that everywhere. So, and when asked, these people would say, yeah, I don't know about this business, but I know the party program. It was harvest time for people who couldn't make a career under a normal competitive system. And there are many such people. We think meritocracy is the natural way our societies are organized. You know, the best people should run the business or the government or institutions such as this, right? They think it is deeply unfair, because under a meritocracy, some random person who just happens to win some competition gets to run an institution, whereas it should be run by patriots. And who decides who's a patriot? The party boss. And so it was a prescription for lowering standards. And it touched hundreds of institutions. During one of the tea breaks, I was telling Grzegorz about what's been done to Polish academic journals. I'm sure you have peer review, but in Poland, there are various journals have points assigned to them. So we have had a education minister who, disregarding expert opinion, put on the list some really marginal publications. For example, the bulletin of the graduates of his department of his Catholic university. And I looked up this particular one, Theological Quarterly, and it struck me that one of the publications for which you could get 100 points, which is to say half of what you can get for an article in Nature or Lancet about a new vaccine, was entitled The Service of a Catholic Priest on a Cruise Ship. Okay, so general lowering of standards. This is what, to me, that regime was about. The disproportion in the representation of rural and urban votes is even bigger than, I can't remember who mentioned it. It's a reality. So for our MP needed on average, I think 48,000 votes to get elected, and a rural MP needed only 36,000. But it's even worse when you count the foreign votes of Poles living abroad. So I can't remember how many were finally cast, but it was between 300 and 400,000, and they only elected one MP. Actually, it should be at least 10 more. So just like in this country, there is this huge overrepresentation of rural areas. Let me tell you more about something that was shown, this clip of Tusk saying für Deutschland. Because when I told people in the European Parliament how it was done, they couldn't believe that you could get away with it in the European Union. The clip comes from the time when Tusk was, after being president of the European Council, he was, for a couple of years, president of EPP, the European People's Party, the largest in the European Parliament, the main Christian Democratic confederation in Europe. And his job was to address national congresses of EPP member parties. And being a good politician, he would always say a few sentences in the native language of that party. So, a few sentences in Spanish, about Croat, French. And when the CDU asked him, this was during the pandemic, so it was remote, he said in German, good luck in your deliberations, but remember, don't think only about what's good for Deutschland, think about what's good for Europe. So he was actually telling the Germans not to be selfish. And yet this was portrayed as him being German. And the sad thing is that this kind of crude propaganda works. It ceased to work in this campaign, but in the previous one in 2019, I was meeting people in the streets while canvassing to be Euro MP, saying to me, you're a German, like Tusk. I said, but I can't even speak German. No, you're German. And with complete conviction, people were, they have these, on state TV, on the main evening news, they have these slogans at the bottom of the screen. And we were meeting hundreds of people who were talking in these slogans. It works. There was this, I'm a Russian stooge as well as being a German because they took a picture of me with Lavrov on the balcony. Of course, I met Lavrov many times. He came to Warsaw, and we had a meeting in the Łazienki Palace, which is the residence of the last king of Poland, which is under strict historic preservation order. And Lavrov says, I have to have a cig. I have to have a cig. No, you can't have it. You can't do it here. This is the king's study. So he said, can I do it on the balcony? I said, all right, we'll go on the balcony. And we spent 3 minutes on the balcony, and they took pictures of me with Lavrov on the balcony. Why did he go out on the balcony? They must have been betraying Poland at that time. They had pictures of Tusk with Putin on the pier in Sopot. This is in 2009, when Putin came for the anniversary of the Second World War, which was actually a Polish diplomatic victory, because he was acknowledging that the Second World War started in Poland, just like his visit to Katyn was a big victory for us. First ruler of Russia who ever did that. They had a photo op. They went up and down. This is when they planned the Smolensk assassination. Literally. And I mean, you had your birther conspiracy, you know? I mean, absurd, disproven, but a quarter of the people believe it. The founding lie of peace rule was the Smolensk conspiracy. Let us ask Comrade Lenin's question. What is to be done? I don't believe we'll have the votes to change the constitution, but we could stabilize the center without changing the constitution. And I think actually the same prescription would apply here. You could move to what I believe operates in Ireland, a system of single transferable vote. So in effect, you have two votes. You elect your party of first preference and your party of second preference. And then there is an incentive to be less polarizing, less extreme, which is the opposite incentive from what you have here and to a large extent in Poland as well. We also have to give a lesson to a generation of Polish politicians that this kind of blatant breaking of the constitution and of laws of decency will not pass, may not happen ever again. They deployed the Pegasus anti-terrorist software on key opposition figures, including on the chief of our election campaign during the previous election, who was hacked dozens of times. And understand that Pegasus is not an eavesdropping software. It doesn't just listen to what you say. It takes over your smartphone, and of course your smartphone is your phone, is your computer, has access to your hard disk in the cloud. It can activate the camera, it can activate the mic, so you can be listened to, and it sucks out all the information, including all your passwords, and it can also put information on it. So they can put files with child pornography on your phone, and you explain that it wasn't you. And this is what they did to several people, including to Tusk's and my lawyer, to the head of we were talking about employers' organization, to the leader of a farmers' union, to the author of a book about the interior minister that they didn't like, and so on and so on. And they say, oh, but we had a court permission to do that. Yeah, but Polish judges didn't know that this system existed, and they didn't tell them. They thought they were giving permission for ordinary eavesdropping. Outrageous behavior. I mean, much worse than Watergate. Watergate was child's play by comparison. This takes over your life, and they actually destroyed some people's lives. Can we restore public media to some kind of objectivity, to some kind of quality? It would be a big challenge. And if we were to do it, we then have to have some procedures whereby a simple majority couldn't take it over again. We have the Constitution. It's important, it should be respected, but we shouldn't be forced to commit political suicide out of respect for the constitution. You know, when Brutus stabbed Caesar, they then did nothing because they thought, right, the law will now take care of everything. And Mark Antony, who was consul at the time, actually changed into a slave's garb and was ready to leave town because he thought they would come for him and that will be the end. Within 48 hours, he saw that they didn't have a plan. He finally persuaded the assassins to let him make the speech at Caesar's funeral. And the mood changed and they regained power. We should not repeat that mistake. As regards the Senate, as a former senator, I believe that it does need reform, but there are various ways of doing it. For example, I think that former presidents and prime ministers shouldn't be just left to lobby, and they should become, I think the Italians have that system, senators for life with an office and with their accumulated experience being useful to the state. We have a huge challenge. So quality needs to be returned to the Polish diplomatic service. We need to end our Cold War with European institutions and with some key allies. Poland should become a leader of European defense and of the eastern flank of both NATO and the European Union. And that can only be done by talking to partners rather than isolating ourselves. We've wasted a long time. Many opportunities have been missed, but I believe Poland is back and will soon play its rightful place, which is as one of the 5 most important countries in the European Union, hopefully a future member of the G20, and soon, I think, one of the 20 largest economies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have very little time, so I would propose that I will take a number of questions from you and then turn the floor back to Radek and let him decide which ones he would like to answer. Okay? All right, so please, Karol, please.
Thank you for this very enlightening speech and explanation. I have a question on the Polish policy on the future of accession. Ukraine has now been promised, and I've been almost certainly in a few days the Council will accept the recommendation of the Commission, and the Ukraine will become a candidate. Negotiations will start. We all know that behind the Ukraine is Moldova. There are the Balkan states who are not willing to wait anymore. Well, we move from 27 to 36. There is a debate now, started also by Olaf Scholz, the Prague speech, saying there must be a reform. Now, apparently, Tusk has said no majority rule on any reform. In fact, no reform. Now, how do you imagine to implement the accession? And Ukraine must become a member. I mean, I guess we'll probably agree on that. Without some reform, and how do you foresee Polish policy on this point?
Karolina, please.
Yes, we have been listening. I have been listening with a great interest. It was an excellent speech. Thank you. We have been talking today about winners and losers, and one might say that in those elections there were only winners or only losers. Only winners because peace had the first result, but of course it was a loser because it cannot form a government successfully. Opposition didn't have the first result, so it was a loss. But then, of course, it is now capable of creating a government. But still, PiS has its 36%, and it's a very strong mandate because those are votes given to one party. As Radosław Markowski stresses, really not so fewer votes than in 2019 election. So one has to have an offer for the PiS voters. PiS voters do not equal, obviously, PiS. What is the offer for the PiS voters for the years to come from the coalition that is going to form the government?
Thank you. Martin.
Yeah, what did you have in mind when you said, and I really enjoyed your speech, when you said don't commit suicide out of respect for the Constitution? Isn't obedience to the Constitution the principle of a liberal democracy? And this argument you use could be used by the other side too.
Lynn, please.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful speech. I have just one question. It perhaps doesn't kind of connect directly to the elections, but throughout the day we were kind of having this discussion about different visions of New Poland, a bit of soul searching, right, on the side of the liberals and so on. And I was thinking, what is the role of the global South for Poland's being in the world in like foreign, policy, like the war with Ukraine, the pandemic, and now what is going on in the Middle East, and the crisis of migration that you mentioned, with which the opposition hit the Peace Party before the elections, kind of shows that Poland is not immune to this kind of global tribulations. And what is the role of that? How can we kind of reconnect, rediscover, if you want, the importance of the connections with the global South?
Okay, these were very important four questions, so I will let you to.
Use the mic. Well, I agree with the premise of your question that we need an enlargement. The compromise will probably mean that it will be a large enlargement. We will want Ukraine, Moldova, together with the Germans. The French will want Serbia. And if you have a large enlargement, then the question you pose arises. One of the ministers of the outgoing government has written a whole book saying that the Polish contribution to the constitutional development of the EU is liberum veto, the principle of unanimity. But I disagree with him. Tusk hasn't said that we will oppose all reform. He just said that what was passed in the European Parliament was too broad and too idealistic. And it really was. We were begging them to delay the vote by a month. We said, look, we've just run a bruising election campaign. We haven't focused on it. We haven't had an internal discussion, even inside the party, let alone in the country. If you're asking me now, we say no. And there is a history to this. Because this is where our competitors have a point. They don't like the history of it, but they do have a point. The history is that before the Lisbon Treaty, under the Nice voting system, Poland had only one vote less in the Council than Germany. Under the Lisbon system, we have half of Germany. Who negotiated the Lisbon Treaty? Jarosław Kaczynski. Who ratified it? Lech Kaczynski. They gave away the shop. And the system of double majority means that when France and Germany, under the Élysée Treaty, coordinate their position, they only need Malta and Luxembourg to have a blocking minority, which gives them too much power. I'm passionately for the European Union, but it has to be fair. And a blocking minority by two large countries in a union of 27 going on 35 will not pass. We are talking about core issues. In Polish politics, we have hysteria, right? So Kaczynski is saying that this is the dismemberment of the Polish state. I mean, that's nuts, okay? But it's an important issue of the distribution of power, okay? Because if it's done fairly, then Europe actually becomes rather nicely balanced between East and West. So no longer Carolinian Europe with additions, but two lungs, Eastern and Western. Some in Western Europe don't like it and are already scheming to prevent it. The landing zone has to be a fair distribution of power. And I don't yet know what it means in practice. But what we achieved in the discussion in the European Parliament is that the proposals of the reform have changed the definition of what it means to drop unanimity. This Polish nationalists have not yet grasped it, but actually something important happened. Namely, the non-unanimity, they now say, is 4/5. Under 4/5, France and Germany don't dominate anymore. So there are various ways of not having unanimity. You know, you can have one country, one vote. You can have larger countries having, you know, a weighted. In Germany, I think larger Länder have 5 votes, smaller ones have 3, and so on, right? You can have a system of votes weighed so that each European vote, the vote of each European rather than each European state weighs the same. Yeah, I treat this as an invitation to a discussion about what should be done. And where, again, this is demagoguery on the nationalist side in Poland, nothing will happen for many years because I'm convinced we are not capable of passing a constitutional treaty like that. The landing zone, I'm convinced, my personal view, will be that it will be done in the enlargement treaty, right? But enlargement changes the context because Poland can do with Ukraine what Germany does with France. And together with Ukraine, we will have more votes than Germany, for example. And then, you know, so this requires a mature discussion in Poland, which will not be helped by demagoguery. I'm afraid that during these 8 years, PiS has moved way to the right on Europe. Basically, the Farage faction, the functional equivalent led by the former Justice Minister Ziobro, has ideologically taken over PiS. As late as 2007, if you look at the PiS manifesto, they understood that strong European institutions were the best protectors of medium-sized and smaller countries. And now it's all Fourth Reich, Germany, you know, destroying Poland, this kind of stuff. Offer for PiS voters, I'm not sure, no. I mean, PiS voters have had their fun for 8 years, and now we need an offer for our voters. You know, I mean, something like 60% of PiS voters are pensioners. They've had a very good offer recently. We will respect it. But for example, Polish small business and medium-sized business is overtaxed. The tax code is overcomplicated. So we need to address those issues. Well, we have a constitutional tribunal which is improperly constituted, and which has been ideological, for example, passing this abortion law, and has been actually pretty lazy for many years, and has suddenly started producing new judgments which are in danger of bankrupting the next budget. And some of these judges are clearly unfit, There's a crazy, literally crazy woman who is and you know who I mean. She's literally nuts. Who's a judge of the Constitutional Tribunal. And we need to find a solution to this because otherwise they will strangulate our government. I hope our lawyers can come up with something constitutional. Poland has a unique advantage by comparison with Western Europe in relations with the global South. We were not colonizers. We were ourselves colonized in the 19th century. And I hope we will reconstitute Warsaw as a hub for pro-democracy activities. So we started a Solidarity Prize of €1 million. We have ODIHR, the institution that oversees elections. We have emigre centers for the Belarusians, for the Free Russians, and others. Poland proposed the European Endowment for Democracy, and so on. So we should be playing to those strengths. And I hope that means that, for example, on Ukraine, we can be more persuasive to the global South than some of our Atlantic allies, because we are not the former colonizers, and we can explain to some of those people that, you know, colonization was also something done in Europe, white on white, not just white and colored. And that the aggression against Ukraine is Europe's last colonial war. This is as if the British decided to recolonize Ireland, and that they should that they should see it from that point of view rather than because Americans support Ukraine, then the Russians must be right. Whereas there is that perspective, I think, unfortunately espoused by the current Pope. And so I think Poland could play an outsized role in promoting democracy in the global South. Thank you.
I hope you share my. I hope you share my view that this was an exciting day, and I would like to thank Radek Sikorski and all the panelists for really amazing presentations. I hope you enjoy it, and there's a lot of things going on at the Center for European Studies, and you are invited to all of that. Just watch our calendar and website. So I hope to see you again very soon. Thank you.